Okay, afternoon everyone. I'm going to talk to you about two poems today. I'm going to start off with Ernest Dowson, and I'm going to call it Non because it's such a long title. I think the most important thing, first of all, is to look at these dates. So we're talking about a late Victorian. And there are two things that we need to know about. The first one being that Dowson belonged to what we call the decadence movement. Katie here will remember that that's associated with such figures as Oscar Wilde and with Swinburne, and it is basically a kind of late romanticism that is known for its love of kind of cynicism and a very dark view of the world. A term that you should be familiar with that we've used before talking about Dracula is the idea of fin de siècle, the French for end of century. And the theory is at the end of the century, usually there's a sense of weariness, something which the French often refer to as ennui, a kind of tired, depressed melancholia and negativeness that is supposed to come at the end of the century. What does the Latin title mean? The Latin title translates as, I am not as I was in the reign of Cinara. It is a poem from the Latin poet Horace, and it is basically a lament of age and of not wanting to fall in love anymore, feeling like love is for a younger man, and that love breeds dissatisfaction, sadness, etc. You'll notice from the opening that this kind of tone is established. Last night, yesterday night. Firstly, I want you to see the frequent use of susurras here, together with the lamentation, which is meant to show this kind of terrible sense of sadness. Who's speaking? Well, it's a dramatic monologue, and it's a dramatic monologue of a man who is in bed with a prostitute. Why is he in bed with a prostitute? Well, it doesn't seem as though he's actually in a state of great physical desire. So why has he bought this sex? Well, he's bought this sex in order to try to erase the memory of his former mistress, Cinara. And he says, betwixt her lips and mine, there fell the shadow of Cinara. By her here, he's referring to the prostitute that he is asleep with. So he's in bed with her, and it could be seen as a kind of romantic scene, but it hasn't been that. It's been a most unsatisfying encounter, and that is because he is haunted by the ghost of his former mistress, Cinara. She starts the poem, and later on you will see that she also ends the poem. There fell thy shadow. Shadow is an interesting word. That's why I say it's almost like a haunting, as though she's a presence there. And look at the rhythm again, the use of susurras. Shadow, comma, Cinara, exclamation mark. That is a strong susurra. And this is a long line. It's a very unusual line in English poetry. It's a 12-syllable line with 6 beats, and we call that hexameter. Common in French, much less common in English. You'll know that most English poetry is pentameter, isn't it? 10 syllables and 5 beats. Here you have the much longer line, and that draws out the poem, and it makes it sound more like a lamentation. It slows it. We feel the speaker's desolation and his sickness and his weariness. And indeed, if we start to look at some of the words, we'll see that. Desolate, sick, old passion, the sense of weariness and desolation. And here we have bowed my head. Now, one other thing you'll notice is that there's the repetition of the 4th and the 6th line throughout the poem. And it's all very well to identify repetitiveness, but here I'm going to tell you that that repetitiveness gives a sense of an unending cycle. It makes it circular, as though the speaker can't move on. And once again, this fits within the paradigm of the idea of a haunting. And the final line of each stanza, I have been faithful to thee, Cinara, in my fashion, I think is a really interesting one. Because I have been faithful to thee, Cinara, is a definite statement. But if we look at the susurra there, and we look at the susurra here, I think you're going to see it creates a sense of uncertainty. Because the qualifying phrase, in my fashion, means actually I haven't been faithful, doesn't it? In my fashion. Well, what could he mean by that? Well, I thought very hard and carefully about that, and I think what he means is I have been faithful in my heart. In my deeds, I've slept with other women, with prostitutes, etc. But these have all been to try to erase and annihilate the memory of you. And in fact, I've been faithful to you in my mind, because I've never forgotten you or lost your image. Now here in the second stanza, you'll note here is where he makes it clear that he's had this very unsuccessful encounter with a prostitute. All night upon my heart, I felt her warm heart beat. Lovely image. Sounds like it could have been enjoyable, pleasant, like there was love there. Night long with mine arms in love, and sleep she lay. Again. Surely the kisses of her bought, but here the key word is bought. It tells us that he paid for this, didn't he? And then we have a very sensual image of her red mouth being sweet. So in a sense, it's a sensual image, but it is undercut immediately by the but, the qualifying but. But I was desolate and sick of old passion. And that is what this poem is all about. It's about old passion contaminating love. This is a man who's been unable to move on. He's stuck with the memory of a former lover. And that's why, again, we have that repetitive refrain. I have been faithful to thee, Sayonara, in my fashion. I have bought much, he goes on, Sayonara, gone with the wind, flung roses, roses riotously with the throng. I want you to see, you've got the strong fricative F, followed by the alliteration of the R's there. We call these rhotic consonants. They're hard and harsh, and they show activity, and they show the desire to escape. So how's he tried to escape? Well, he's flung himself into highly sensual, highly physical things, hoping that this would erase the memory of her. We've got this word here, the throng, dancing, flung. So hard verbs, and throng meaning crowds, trying to make himself anonymous through hedonism, through physical activity, to get rid of the pain that love has caused him. So that this is love as being haunted. In the next poem, we'll look at love as illness and love as a disease. And he says, yea, all the time, because the dance was long. So there again, in spite of this activity here, this passion, it collapses back into the very desolate, very sad, very weary tone. Yea, all the time, because the dance was long. Again, frequent use of the caesura, isn't it? To pause, to drag out the line, to create this tone of exhaustion, this tone of being defeated. Now we move on to the final stanza, okay? I cried for madder music and for stronger wine. So we have our alliterative M's here. And this stanza is all about the intensification of the physical experience. So here we have him dancing riotously now. Now he wants the music turned up. He wants it louder. He wants stronger wine. So he's looking for intoxication. He's looking to annihilate memory again. And when the feast is finished and the lamps expire is a key word. That piece of personification is a use of pathetic fallacy, which goes throughout the poem, isn't it? That the environment reflects his sadness, his weariness. Are the lamps dying, or is he? Obviously, he's projecting onto his environment and showing the depth of his sadness and the depth of his desolation. And then you'll notice the shadow returns. So once again, she's a shadow. Does that mean that she's dead? Or does it mean that she is part of the past and as good as dead? So shadow comes with all of those connotations of evil from the Bible. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. This notion that shadow is associated with darkness, with being spiritually lost, etc. Here, though, Sayonara comes to haunt him. And so despite all of his efforts to erase her, whether that's through crazy dancing, whether that's through sleeping with prostitutes, whether it's through stronger wine, all the efforts to listen to madder, crazier, louder music, the idea if he overloads the senses, somehow he can overcome this terrible love affair, have failed. And the shadow returns. The night is thine. And that possessive pronoun is really interesting, isn't it? Because it shows her in power. This is going to link to the Keats poem that we do in a minute, where La Belle Sans Merci is also, the beautiful woman without mercy, is also completely in power and enthroned. So it's the notion that men are mastered by female power through the act of love. And we're going to see in quite a few of our poems the idea of man as a kind of victim, and love being a woman's game, and love giving woman incredible power. And I am desolate and sick of old passion, yea, hungry for the lips of my desire. Well, notice here, earlier, he seemed to have no real desire, even when he's with this supposedly beautiful prostitute. His desire here, however, is incredibly strong. It's described as hungry, and it has the very sensual image of lips. I have been faithful to thee, Sayonara, in my fashion. Well, this man does seem to be faithful in a way, doesn't he? This isn't just verbal sophistry and clever rhetoric like we've seen in the metaphysical and cavalier poets, where they use words to mystify and convince women of untruth. Here, there is a kind of truth. There is a certain kind of faithfulness. If faithfulness means memory, and keeping a memory strong, alive, and vivid, then it has to be the case that our speaker of Non Sum has been faithful. So ironically, in spite of the fact that he's far from being faithful in his actions, it would appear that in terms of memory and his heart and the truth of his desires, he is indeed faithful. Okay, folks, time to move on now to Jonathan Keats and to the poem La Belle Sans Merci. Well, this is one of the most famous paintings of it by a pre-Raphaelite artist. I think it's Waterhouse. I should have looked it up before I printed off the picture. I thought it was a good way of starting so you could get an idea of this is a kind of archetype of a female who bewitches a man through eroticness, through being beautiful, through magic kissing, through singing. And it's the idea, once again, it links to the poem that we've just looked at, Non Sum, in a way, because in this case, a woman has all of the power. A man is enchanted and entrapped, unable to escape. If you look at the painting, you'll see the man is supposed to be in a kind of zombie-like fashion, isn't he? He's kind of meant to be from The Walking Dead. And once he's kissed by La Belle Sans Merci, he forever will wander, and he will waste away and die. He will forget everything else. All he will want is to hunger for those lips again, and of course they will never be there. Another very beautiful picture here. I thought I'd show you this one, because La Belle Sans Merci in poetry and fiction is often a beautiful singer who puts you to sleep through lullabies, etc. And you'll see that she's completely in control. And she works with nature and the nymphs and the dryads of the trees. So she's a kind of fairy. Now, fairy in Shakespeare's day is spelled F-A-E-R-Y. Today, fairy means like sort of lovely little Tinkerbell thing, or, you know, possibly a gay person. And I'm using that deliberately because it's the idea that of something very effeminate and dainty. It wasn't the case at all. So when Keats uses the old-fashioned spelling of fairy, the archaic spelling of fairy, he's referring to the kind of fairy that you find in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck. And those fairies are pretty vicious. They kicked you, they knocked you over things, they were mischievous and wicked. And fairy can actually almost have connotations of witch in this context. So forget Tinkerbell, we're thinking Puck. We're thinking quite nasty and quite manipulative in many ways. And the final picture I'm going to concentrate on very quickly over here. you'll be pleased to see, very relieved to see that it's been censored so that we're culturally sensitive, are the sirens. And the sirens are female figures who come from Homer's Odyssey. They are beautiful naked women who live in the waves and who sing to you, Adam. And they sing to you and you see their nakedness, and men are so erotically charged and so excited and so enamored of these beautiful nymphs that they drown themselves and follow them into the water. And the nymphs have no feelings whatsoever. It's almost like they take pleasure in men's weakness and they manipulate men's desire, just for their own gain. And now the poem. It is a ballad, and that is absolutely crucial, because I'm going to give you a little bit of background. The Romantics loathed the modern world. William Blake, for instance, called industrial mills dark, satanic mills. So they often retreated into a bygone age, and in particular, they romanticize medieval times. I think you can see a lot of poets doing this from the Romantic time, whether it's Wordsworth or Coleridge, whether it's Shelley or Keats or Byron. They all looked at the feudal time as being a more romantic kind of mystical time, a world filled with magic, etc. And this, like many romantic poems, has a strong supernatural element to it. The ballad usually is very impersonal. It doesn't name people. It has very short lines, and it is very short on description. It is characterized by what we call ellipsis, leaving lots of things out. Ellipsis, by leaving things out, actually creates a sense of enigma. By not giving you the full story, it asks as many questions as it provides you with answers, okay? And the poem opens very interestingly. It says, "Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and pale loitering?" Well, what do we know from this? Well, first of all, we don't know who's speaking, do we? It's an anonymous person, and we have to work out the story. And clearly what's happened is there is a knight who's wandering. Do you recall the picture that we started off with? The knight over here, can you see? Confused, dazed, confused, disorientated. Well, it's such a person that the anonymous speaker is addressing. And we know that he is now in a terrible state because he is pale, he's alone. And we get the use of pathetic fallacy. The sedge would mean a bit like bulrushes, or the kind of plants that grow in water. The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Well, we've got the pathetic fallacy there, because nature seems to be dying. It seems to be sickening. And this obviously reflects the knight's state of mind. And now we read on to find what has caused the sickening in both nature and in the psyche of the knight. And again we have the lamentation of, oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms? So the ballad form is also highly repetitive. It's highly repetitive with very short lines, have you noticed? It is tetrameter, 8 syllables, is it not? You'll notice the structure of it is that there are 3 tetrameter lines, and then a much shorter ultimate line, okay? And this shortness of line I'll be discussing in a moment. So, as I said, the ballad is designed to be sung, and that's why there's lots of repetition in it. So haggard and so woe-begone. Of course, you have this rhyme, which gives quite a quick tempo. The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest done. So, it's identified as autumn. And again, if you think about autumn, in Keats's poetry is often seen as the dying month, because all the fruit and the vegetables and everything has been harvested now, and the earth is going to sleep and die. And the imagery continues because the speaker notices, I see the lily on thy brow. The lily to the Romantics is the personification of death. It is the flower of death, with anguish moist and fever dew. Well, it's worth bringing in a little bit of biography here because Keats died at the age of 23. He died from tuberculosis. And so he had a very long and lingering death that would have involved quite a lot of fever. So he's a man who writes obsessively about mortality and early death. And here we have, again, a very archetypal idea of love, This is love as sickness, love as leading to death. Again, it's a very chivalric, medieval, fin amour idea of love, which is that love is so often unrequited. It is this way in chivalric love, and it comes from the famous Italian poet Petrarch, who I'm sure you guys will remember, the man who wrote all of the sonnets and who developed the Petrarchan sonnet form. And all of those sonnets concern love with a woman who's unobtainable, who you will never have, and the whole process of depression and sickening and life as dreary that comes and follows from this terrible unrequited love. And indeed, our knight here who's been described is such a man. He is a fading rose. He withereth. So he's like a plant dying. We have the extended metaphors there. And here he's speaking. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. This comes back to the fairies that I told you of. And I want to remind you here, we're not thinking effeminate fairy, we're thinking quite powerful, bewitching fairy. Her hair long, her foot was light. Interestingly here, there's something sort of airy, spiritual about her, almost as though she's a supernatural being rather than a physical being. Long hair is invariably associated with the Romantics and with the Elizabethans with the idea of sexuality and erotica. Her eyes were wild. So this is a very Victorian idea. Remember, Keats is writing just on the cusp of the Victorian period. He's writing a little bit before that. He's basically the second generation of Romantics. And he writes very sensuously. And here the archetype is of a kind of sensual, erotic wildness. That's a word that's going to reoccur, and an image that's going to reoccur in the poem. And like all good chivalric lovers, he absolutely prostrates himself before her, and he worships her, doesn't he? He makes a garland for her head. He makes bracelets too, and the fragrant zone. She looked at me as though she did love, and made sweet moan. The moan is obviously meant to be a very erotic, sexual kind of idea, and it shows that he's lost in this kind of sensual admiration for her, doesn't it? And you will notice that here we have the idea of woman as being very highly manipulative, and this takes us back to the title of La Belle Sans Danse Merci, the idea that women enjoy this power, this bewitching of men. Love to them is a game of power. So you could argue that in many ways it's quite a misogynistic tradition of men being weakened. In a way, you could look back at narratives like Samson and Delilah. Right, moving on to stanza number 6. This is when he's absolutely infatuated with her. Notice the rhythm. I set on my pacing steed and nothing else saw all day long. For sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy song. So here she's singing to him, and this is where we get the idea, of course, of the sirens and this incredibly damaging kind of song that bewitches you, in which you lose your senses. So love as a trap, desire as a kind of trap. Moving on to stanza number 7. She found me roots of relish sweet. Well, this is quite an interesting one. She's feeding him, and she's feeding him a kind of godlike food. You know, roots might suggest a kind of drug or an aphrodisiac, might it not? And many of the Romantics were very interested in this whole idea of losing your mind and going into a drug-like sleep, etc. And love was often seen in this way. They were very interested in Homer's part of the Odyssey, where the sailors stop on the island of Circe and they eat the lotus flower. The lotus flower is a kind of drug, and you forget everything, and you are completely in the power of the people there. So it has this kind of amnesia effect on you, and that's what seems to happen here. So she is like some kind of wood nymph or spirit. She feeds them on lovely organic stuff, doesn't she? Roots, wild honey, and manna, dew. Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because manna is the bread sent from God to feed the Jews when they lost in the desert. And you'll notice that it's hyphenated, so it actually becomes a compound word, manaju. Now, Jew isn't actually a food, so it gives this sense of, rather than it being physical food, almost like a kind of supernatural, spiritual food. So again, this is where this whole idea of her being a kind of magical, heavenly creature, not of this earth, some kind of seraphic being who has enchanting powers, comes from. And she says, I love thee true. Well, we've seen so many poems in which men have lied, haven't we? I think the Scrutiny comes to mind, doesn't it, yeah? But here we have a woman using rhetoric and enchanting and entrapping a man. And again, a man as a victim. Okay, moving on. And then she lulled me. We've got all these lovely liquid sounds, haven't we? And there I dreamed. Okay. And woe betide, he says. So look how this line here is broken by the hyphen, the Sora, and we have these exclamation marks. So in the midst of his dream, he wakes up. It's like there's some spirits warning him of how he is really in danger. And as Amy just reminded me, I will quickly deal with this stanza over here. She took me to her elfin grot. This stanza is important because there is clearly a consummation. And it would appear that they make love here. Isn't that what the 4 kisses mean? And he shuts her wild, wild eyes. We've got that repetitive W there. And again, that sense of kind of erotic abandonment. And it's like he loses himself in sex and sensuality and stuff, okay? And then, of course, he has a little postcoital sleep. And that's where he's woken up by this kind of sense of alarm. And what happens? In the midst of that stanza, instead of finding himself in the arms of his beloved, he finds himself on a cold hillside. And so this is the state that we find him in at the beginning of the poem, isn't it? He is the abandoned person here. So think about gender and think this time it's been inverted, hasn't it? The man has been used sexually. The man has been enchanted and entrapped. And here he is abandoned. And he is in an effeminate position now, isn't he? Powerlessly walking, dying, hungering for love, wondering why he's been tricked by this rhetoric, asking himself why this kind of artful temptress, this femme fatale, has decided to trick him into love in this way. And who is it that talked to him? Pale kings, princes, warriors, death pale. All of them are alpha males, aren't they? Men in positions of great power. Notice pale kings you could read as an oxymoron, couldn't you? King being so powerful and masculine, but here pale, reduced, effeminate, weak, drained of blood and energy. So again, love being represented as something which reduces men, coming from the Samson narrative, isn't it? That female seduction drains men of their blood, their virility, their power, their energy, etc. They cried, La Belle Non Sum Qualis hath thee in thrall. And thrall here in romantic times would mean kind of hypnotize. To be in thrall means that you are worshipping, that you have given up all power, that you are prostrate before this all-powerful woman. So you could read it again like male fears of a very powerful woman, couldn't you? Very much like we saw when we studied Dracula, that terrible fear that we have of this late Victorian woman who is powerful and can exert a kind of erotic pull over men. And what does he see now? I saw their starved lips. So again we have the extended metaphor as love of being a kind of hunger. You'll recall that she fed him the manna dew before, this mythical food. And this goes back to the idea that once you taste the food of the gods, you can never eat again. And so you're destroyed. You've eaten this wonderful ambrosia, this wonderful supernatural substance. So the earth thereafter is a barren and bleak place. and you're going to sicken and die and forever hunger to get back to the spiritual realm. In this case, it's less of a spiritual realm and more of a kind of erotic and sensual realm. And so these terrible male figures, male victims, starved, are in the gloam. Gloam, again, is a very medieval word, and the Romantics were very, very fond of archaism. And gloam here means twilight. So once again, you have a kind of pathetic fallacy, because the light has been drained, just as the lifeblood of this particular night has been drained, with horrid warning gapes. Gape being a very frightening onomatopoeic word, with this mouth opening, not knowing what they are doing, not being able to feed themselves, terrible helplessness. So this nightmare is basically the vision of what his state is now, what he's been reduced to by this powerful La Belle Non Sum Qualis. And I awoke and found me here, on the cold hillside. And this is why I sojourn. Sojourn means a really long, slow journey here, alone and palely loitering. And we know loitering means not actually really getting anywhere, not really moving. Through the sedge, you'll remember the sedge is withered from the lake. So again, we have autumn, but we also have this idea of the drying up of nature, that moisture and everything is disappearing, that the land is dying, that it is barren, and that there are no birds singing. So we end in this kind of extended metaphor, this use of pathetic fallacy, which represents his sickening. And I think we're left to believe now that he's on a decline, dying for love.